The first thing Assessor Vale Oren noticed about the human was that it was still breathing. This should not have been remarkable. The human had been extracted from a decompression event 41 standard hours prior, recovered from a debris field at the outer boundary of the Kefsaluar engagement zone, sealed inside a medical isolation unit, and transported across approximately 9 light minutes of contested space to Waystation Orenduf. Its biosigns had fluctuated 3 times during transport in ways that Valoran's medical colleagues had collectively described as incompatible with continued biological function. The attending physician, a Sorini named Chethes, had filed 2 separate preliminary mortality reports during transit, both of which had needed to be withdrawn. And yet, the human was still breathing. Valoran stood outside the isolation unit's observation window and watched it for a long moment before opening his log. He was a small being by most galactic standards, narrow-framed, gray-scaled, with 3 horizontal slits where other species kept eyes, and he had spent 11 years as a coalition field assessor, which meant that his professional function was to observe things that did not fit into existing categories and then write careful, measured reports about them. He was good at this. He had assessed 47 first contact scenarios, 19 post-battle extraction procedures, and 1 event that the Coalition's institutional memory still classified under the deliberately vague heading of Anomalous Species Behavioral Incident, Tessari Cluster. He opened his log and wrote, *Human subject, female, designation Warrant Officer Sarah Voss, recovered from Sector 7 debris field following the Kefsaluar engagement. Subject exhibits continued vital signs despite 3 documented periods of apparent physiological failure during transit. No satisfactory medical explanation has been provided. Recommend extended observation. He closed the log, looked at the human again, and added nothing. Because there was nothing to add. Not yet. The human was sleeping. Or, more precisely, the human was doing something that resembled sleep, horizontal, still, eyes closed, the slow rhythmic compression of a chest rising and falling, but which Chethes had informed him was technically a state of induced physiological recovery that the humans called unconsciousness from injury, and which was, apparently, different from their normal sleep in several important ways, the most significant of which was that the human could not currently be woken up and had been in this state for 18 hours and was, according to Chethes, quote, doing fine. Valoran had asked Chethes to define fine. Chethes had displayed the particular kind of silence that medical professionals use when they do not want to admit that they do not know the answer. This was how it began. Not with the Kefsaluar. Not with the war. Not with the 47-hour engagement that had broken 3 coalition fleet formations and left the Orendath sector exposed in a way that every strategic model had predicted would take 14 months to remediate. It began with a single human in an isolation unit, breathing when it had no particular reason to be doing so, and an assessor who could not explain it. Valoran filed his first report at 0630 station time. It was 3 paragraphs long, professionally written, and contained 1 sentence that he would later mark as the most significant thing he had written in his career. The sentence read, "The human's continued survival appears to be occurring independently of any clinical intervention, which raises questions about our baseline assumptions regarding human biological resilience that I do not currently have sufficient data to answer." He did not yet understand that this was the correct question. He also did not yet understand what asking it would cost him. The war itself, the thing the Coalition was calling the Kefsaluar expansion, and which the Kefsaluar themselves were, according to intercepted communications, calling the Restoration, had been ongoing for approximately 19 standard months when the humans arrived. This was not a short war by Coalition standards. The Tessari conflict had lasted 6 months. The Orindathi territorial dispute had been resolved in 11. The Kefsaluar were different. The Kefsaluar were different in ways that the Coalition's Military Analysis Division had been reluctant to admit until the numbers became too large to politely ignore. The numbers were these: 19 months. 412 distinct engagement events. A Coalition loss rate of approximately 63% of contested objectives. 11 member species of the Coalition with active military presences in the conflict zone, of which 9 had formally requested to reduce their rotational commitments, 3 had submitted diplomatic inquiries about strategic reassessment, and 1, the Vorith, a species with a strong institutional memory of successful military operations, had quietly begun preliminary evacuation of their civilian populations from their 3 nearest border worlds. The coalition was losing. Not dramatically. Not catastrophically. In the manner of a well-engineered structure experiencing metal fatigue, slowly, almost imperceptibly, with occasional small collapses that the engineers kept explaining were normal and expected and within acceptable parameters, until one day the parameters shifted and the collapses became something else. The humans had arrived at month 17, 2 months before the Kefsaluar engagement that left Warrant Officer Sarah Voss floating in a debris field with 3 preliminary mortality reports filed against her name. Thorin had not been present for the humans' formal arrival. He had been on Tessari Prime, filing reports on a secondary engagement, but he had read the transcripts of the Coalition Integration Committee's initial assessment, and he had found them interesting in the way that only a professional observer could find things interesting, with a detached recognition that something important was being missed, without yet being able to identify what. The transcript read, in relevant part, * human delegation present, 17 individuals, mixed military and diplomatic personnel. Primary contact, Ambassador Commander Designation Harlow, presented coalition membership application and joint military cooperation agreement simultaneously, which the committee found procedurally irregular. When asked to separate the 2 documents per standard protocol, Ambassador Commander Harlow indicated that the documents were not separable and appeared to find the committee's confusion somewhat amusing. Session extended by 40 minutes to allow committee members to process this position. Final determination, provisional acceptance pending standard assessment, *. Valoran had read this transcript 3 times. The phrase he kept returning to was, appeared to find the committee's confusion somewhat amusing. He did not know, at that point, whether this was arrogance or something else. He had filed it in the part of his mind reserved for things that did not have a category yet. The human, Warrant Officer Sarah Voss, woke up on the 3rd day. Thorin was not there when it happened. He learned about it from Chetha S's medical report, which was notable primarily for its tone, which was the tone of a physician who had expected to document a recovery and had instead documented something that made recovery seem like the wrong word. The report noted that Voss had regained consciousness, declined pain management medication on the grounds that she needed to think clearly, assessed her own injuries with what Chetha described as clinical detachment unusual in a patient experiencing her level of physiological damage, and then asked, before asking anything else, before asking where she was, before asking about her crew, before asking about the battle, asked for a communication terminal. Chetha had asked her why. Voss had said, I have a report to file. Chetha had asked if she understood that she had been unconscious for 3 days following a decompression event and 3 periods of apparent cardiac failure. Voss had said, yes. I'll need to account for the gap. Can I have the terminal? Chetha had given her the terminal. Thorin read this report and sat with it for a while. Then he requested clearance to interview the human directly, filed the appropriate documentation, and went to the medical bay. Voss was sitting up when he arrived. This was medically inadvisable according to Chetha notes, but Voss had been medically inadvisable since before she arrived at the station, so the notes had a quality of resigned documentation rather than genuine alarm. She was writing something on the terminal. She did not stop when he entered, which was either a social violation or a cultural difference, and Valoran had enough professional experience to suspend judgment. He stood by the door. She finished what she was writing, looked up, and assessed him in a way that he found briefly uncomfortable, not hostile, not curious, but with a flatness of expression that he could not read. Most species he dealt with had legible faces. Expressions that translated clearly enough across biological differences. The human's face was doing something that he did not have a reference for. She said, Assessor? He said, yes. I apologize for the interruption. I can return at a more suitable time. She said, now it's fine. She said it in the same way that someone might say that the weather was unremarkable. No particular emphasis. He pulled his recorder out and asked her what she remembered about the engagement. She told him, She told him in precise, ordered language, with specific references to temporal sequences and tactical decisions and the failure points in the coalition formation that had preceded the decompression event. She described watching 2 of the 4 ships in her unit destroyed with a particularity of detail that made Valoran's recording hands slow slightly, because the detail was not the kind of detail that belonged to someone who had not understood what they were watching. It was not the imprecise recall of someone in shock. It was the specific, careful memory of someone who had been paying very close attention during an event that most species' crisis response systems would have prevented them from fully perceiving. He asked her, "What were you thinking when the decompression event occurred?" She considered this question for a moment. She said, "I was thinking about the ventral relay station on the Kethsaluar secondary formation. I'd noticed something about its firing pattern about 4 minutes before the breach." He said, "What did you notice?" She said, "It was compensating. The rhythm was off by about 0.3 seconds in the third-tier sequences. That kind of compensation usually means the operator is covering for damage or interference somewhere in the relay chain. I wanted to log it before I lost the observation." He said, "The decompression event occurred during this analysis?" She said, "Yes." He wrote, Warrant Officer Voss continued tactical analysis during a life-threatening emergency event. This does not appear to have been deliberate. She seems to have simply not prioritized the emergency above the tactical observation. He did not write what he was actually thinking, which was, "I do not know what to do with this information." He asked, "And when you regained consciousness 3 days later, your first concern was filing a report about the relay station?" She said, "I still needed to log the observation. The information might be useful." He looked at her. She looked back at him with that flat, unreadable expression. He closed his recorder and thanked her for her time. He walked back to his office and sat for 11 minutes doing nothing, which was not his professional habit. Then he opened a new document and began to write, not a formal report, but the kind of informal analytical notes that assessors kept for their own reference. He wrote, "The human continued working during a situation that should have saturated her cognitive resources with survival-relevant inputs. This is not an exceptional individual. Based on what I have read of human military records, she is described as competent but not unusually distinguished. Which means this is not exceptional human behavior. Which means this is normal." He stopped writing. He looked at the wall. Then he wrote one more line. "I don't think we have correctly understood what normal means for this species." He saved the document and filed it under a category he created specifically for this purpose, which he labeled, with professional understatement, Human Behavioral Notes, pending further analysis. The analysis would become necessary sooner than he expected. The Kethsaluar crossed the Orendath perimeter 11 days after Voss's recovery. This was not supposed to happen. The Orendath perimeter was a coalition defensive line with 4 redundant support structures and 3 dedicated fleet wings assigned specifically to its maintenance. The strategic models had assessed the probability of Kethsaluar penetration at less than 8%, and the models had been reviewed twice in the previous month and both times confirmed. Valoran trusted the models. Everyone trusted the models. The models had been built on 40 years of coalition military history and were considered, by people who built such things, to be very good. The Kethsaluar crossed the perimeter in approximately 6 hours. They did not break through the redundant support structures. They went around them. They had apparently been repositioning their secondary fleet elements in a pattern that the coalition's monitoring systems had categorized as logistical movement for the previous 3 weeks, because the pattern resembled, quite closely, the Kethsaluar's own historical logistical positioning signatures. The coalition's analysis teams had looked at the pattern and seen what they expected to see. Later, when the post-engagement reports were being compiled, someone would note that the pattern differed from historical logistical positioning in 17 specific ways. The note would be filed. It would not receive the attention it deserved, because by the time it was filed, the Orendath perimeter was already gone and there were more urgent things to address. The Kethsaluar's penetration of the Orendath perimeter put way station Orendath and everything on it, including the medical bay, including Warrant Officer Voss, including Assessor Valoran, inside a conflict zone. This changed several things. The evacuation order for non-essential personnel went out within the hour. Vale Orin was, technically, non-essential personnel, in that his function was analytical rather than operational. He received the evacuation notification on his personal device and read it standing in the corridor outside the station's Tactical Operations Center, where he had gone to observe the situation as it developed, because observing developing situations was what he did. He did not immediately go to the evacuation terminal. He was watching something. The Tactical Operations Center was, at this moment, the site of a particular kind of institutional stress that Vale Orin had seen before, but not quite in this form. There were 17 station personnel in the room, representing 6 different species, and they were all processing the same information: the perimeter breach, the Kef-Salular advance, the gap between the strategic models and the emerging reality, and responding to it in the ways that their species' crisis response systems were designed for. The Sorini, like Chifis, were becoming very still and very precise. The Vorith were running rapid calculation sequences. The Orindathi were clustering near their senior personnel in the instinctive social grouping that their species used in situations of threat. These were all rational, species-appropriate responses. The 2 humans in the room, Voss had apparently been cleared from medical and was now here, which Chehis had not been consulted about, were doing something different. They were talking to each other. Not loudly. Not dramatically. In the low, quick, back-and-forth manner of people who had worked together long enough that they had a shared shorthand. Voss was pointing at something on a display, and the other human, a male, older, designation Commander Eric Knoll, who had arrived on Orindath 2 weeks ago with the 2nd Coalition Liaison Team, was listening and nodding and occasionally shaking his head in the way that humans apparently did when they disagreed but were still processing the argument. They were looking at the Kef-Salular advance data. They were not, as far as Vale Orin could tell, experiencing institutional stress. They looked like people solving a problem. Vale Orin put his evacuation notification back in his pocket and stayed. 12 minutes later, Commander Knoll walked to the station's senior tactical officer, a Vorith named Sathvor, and said something that Sathvor's recorded reaction suggested he found either very useful or very alarming or possibly both simultaneously. Veorin was not close enough to hear what Knoll said. He later obtained the transcript. Knoll had said, "The Kef-Salular secondary formation is maintaining a 0.3-second delay in their third-tier relay sequences. They've had this delay for at least 2 weeks based on Warrant Officer Voss's field observation, which means it's either intentional or structural. Either way, there's a gap in their coordinated fire coverage of approximately 11 seconds in every 5th rotation cycle. I can show you where it is." Sathvor had said, "How does Warrant Officer Voss have an observation from 2 weeks ago? She was in medical." Knoll had said, "She filed her report from the medical bay." Sathvor had processed this for 4 seconds, which was a long time for a Vorith. Then he had said, "Show me." What happened next took place over the following 22 hours, and Vale Orin observed as much of it as he was permitted to observe, which was more than he was probably supposed to, because the humans' particular approach to institutional boundaries seemed to be that they were aware of the boundaries but had developed a practice of politely acknowledging them while also not actually stopping what they were doing. He watched Voss and Knoll work. He had observed many species under operational pressure. He had his own scales for assessing how different beings performed under the particular compound stress of time constraint, physical danger, and cognitive demand. What he was watching did not fit his scales. It was not that the humans were faster. They were not. Sathvor could run probability calculations at a speed that no human could match. The Vorith tactical team was processing data at a rate that clearly exceeded what Voss and Knoll could accomplish. In terms of raw cognitive throughput, the humans were not the most impressive actors in the room. What they were doing was something different. They were wrong. They were wrong in a productive way that Vale Orin spent several hours trying to understand and finally documented as humans appear to generate and discard incorrect hypotheses at an extraordinarily high rate, and this process does not appear to damage their confidence or their momentum. Most species, when they identify an error, spend time in recalibration. The humans appear to simply reclassify the error as data and continue. This is cognitively wasteful by conventional standards and yet appears to result in a kind of navigational flexibility that more careful analytical approaches do not produce. Asterisk. Knoll proposed 7 tactical approaches in 6 hours. 5 were discarded, 1 partially implemented, 1, the 7th, was the one that mattered. It was the 7th one that Sathvor took to the station command, and it was the 7th one that became the basis for what would later be called the Orendath response, which was not a battle, exactly, but rather a specific kind of tactical problem-solving that used the 11-second gap in the Kethsaluar firing pattern as a structural weakness to be methodically exploited in a sequence of targeted disruptions over 14 hours. The Kethsaluar advance slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Valoran noted this distinction carefully in his records. He had already learned to be careful about what he claimed for the humans. They had not performed a miracle. They had identified a weakness that, in retrospect, several coalition analysts would say they should have seen themselves, and they had figured out how to use it. What was harder to explain was how they had identified it in the first place. Voss had noticed the 0.3-second delay during a decompression event. During a decompression event, Valoran had been keeping his analytical notes in a document he'd originally titled Human Behavioral Notes, Pending Further Analysis. He renamed it on the 4th day of the Orendath crisis. He renamed it simply, The Problem. The problem was not that humans were particularly powerful. They were not. They had no exceptional sensory capabilities, no superior biological resilience in most measurable dimensions, no cognitive processing speed that exceeded the best performance of several coalition species. They were a middle-of-the-range species in almost every category that the coalition used to evaluate potential military partners. The problem was what happened to them under conditions that coalition strategic models assumed would degrade their performance. It didn't. Or rather, Valoran was becoming increasingly careful with his language. It degraded it in ways that the models could measure, while producing other effects that the models had no categories for. He began formally requesting access to the humans' own records. This was not unusual for an assessor. His access request went through standard channels and was approved by the Human Liaison Office at the Coalition Integration Committee, and 3 days later he had access to approximately 40 years of human military records, which was everything they had provided to the coalition upon application, which was considerable. He spent 2 weeks reading. At the end of 2 weeks, he filed a formal assessment update that was 14 pages long and contained, in the final section, the following paragraph. Asterisk, I must note as an institutional matter that our integration assessment of human military capabilities was conducted using standard coalition evaluative frameworks, and that this assessment was, in my professional view, significantly incomplete. This is not because the frameworks were incorrectly applied. It is because the frameworks do not contain categories for the behavioral patterns that human military history consistently demonstrates, and the absence of these categories meant that the most significant aspects of human military performance were invisible to the assessment process. I am attaching a preliminary list of suggested framework additions. I want to be transparent that I do not yet fully understand what I am describing. The 14-page report went to the Integration Committee. The suggested framework additions were received and noted and assigned to a subcommittee. The subcommittee met 3 weeks later and determined that the framework additions were premature without additional supporting data. Valoran read the subcommittee's determination and did not file a response. He was already busy. The Kethsaluar's advance had slowed, but it had not stopped, and Knoll and Voss's tactical input at Orendath had done something that Valoran suspected was both useful and alarming in a way that nobody had yet formally acknowledged. It had demonstrated that the humans could find things that the coalition's analytical systems missed. This was useful because those things often mattered. It was alarming because it raised a question that nobody had asked yet, but which Valoran had been turning over in his mind for days. The question was, what else were the coalition's analytical systems missing? He didn't have the answer to this question, but he knew who might. He went back to Voss. She was, at this point, officially assigned to Orendath Station as a coalition liaison tactical consultant, which was a designation created specifically for her because no existing designation fit. She had a small office near the Tactical Operations Center. When Valoran arrived, she was sitting at her desk looking at a data display with an expression that he had, over the past weeks, begun to recognize. Not happy, not troubled, just the particular focused stillness of someone examining something that didn't make sense yet. He said, "May I ask you something that is outside my formal assessment scope?" She looked up. She said, "Sure." He said, "When you noticed the firing pattern delay during the decompression event, you said it was because you wanted to log the observation before you lost it. Before you lose the observation, you mean?" She said, "Before I lost consciousness." He said, "Yes. My question is, how were you making new observations at that point? Physiologically, Cheth's medical report suggests that your cognitive systems should have been prioritizing survival-relevant data." She considered this. She said, "I'm not sure I can explain it in a way that translates well. We do a lot of training, human military training, that's specifically about maintaining function when your body is telling you to stop. It's not comfortable. You spend enough time learning to work past that signal that eventually the signal becomes less loud. It's still there. I was still scared. I knew what was happening. But the information about the relay station was also there, and I knew I might not get another chance to record it." Valoran said, "You continued detailed analysis because you were afraid of losing the data." She said, "I suppose so." He said, "Not because you were not afraid." She said, "No. I was afraid." He said, "I see." He wrote, later, "The key distinction that I had missed. Humans do not appear to be resistant to fear in the way that I initially assumed when I observed their continued function under stress. They experience fear. They experience it in full. What they have developed, through training, through culture, through something in their psychology that I don't have a word for yet, is the ability to continue functioning in the presence of fear. This is different from what I thought I was seeing. This is different from courage in the sense that the coalition usually defines it. It is something more like a learned capacity to hold two incompatible states simultaneously and operate from both of them at once. **. He looked at this paragraph for a long time. Then he wrote, "I don't know if this is remarkable or terrifying. I think it may be both. The war shifted, in the way that wars sometimes do, not through a single decisive event but through a series of smaller adjustments that accumulated into something different. The humans had been formally integrated into coalition military operations by month 3 of their arrival, which meant month 20 of the war, and the integration had been difficult in the procedural sense. The coalition's command structures were not designed for the way humans made decisions, which was often faster and less formally hierarchical than the standard command process, but productive in ways that were accumulating in the data. The data was becoming uncomfortable. Valoran had been asking for it systematically as part of his ongoing assessment function, and what it showed was this. In engagements where human units were involved, the loss rate on contested objectives was lower. Not dramatically. Not in a way that looked, on first review, like anything more than ordinary variation. But when Valoran corrected for objective difficulty and resource allocation, the pattern became consistent enough that it was not variation. It was signal. He filed a report. The report was received. It was sent to the Military Analysis Division. 3 weeks later, the Analysis Division sent back a response that said, essentially, that the pattern was interesting but that more data was needed. Valoran read the response and noted, in his private records, that the Analysis Division's methodology for evaluating the pattern involved applying the same frameworks that his 14-page report had identified as insufficient for assessing human performance. He did not file a response to the Analysis Division. He was learning to pick the moments when institutional communication was useful. The moment that changed things, not the war, but his understanding of what the war was becoming, came in month 23 at a place called the Sethvar Approach. The Sethvar Approach was a strategic corridor that the Kethsaluar needed to maintain their supply lines to the forward edge of their advance. If the corridor was disrupted, the forward advance would stall for what the coalition's models estimated at 40 to 90 days, long enough to allow a significant repositioning of coalition forces. The models were very confident about this. The Sethvar Approach was well identified, the strategic logic was sound, and the Coalition Command had been wanting to act on it for 6 weeks. The problem was that the SciFi approach was also very well defended. The Coalition had sent 3 separate assessment teams to evaluate approaches to the corridor. All 3 teams had reached the same conclusion. Penetrating the HFY defensive network at SciFi would require a frontal asset commitment that would cost more than the strategic gain was worth. The humans had not been asked to assess SciFi. They had asked themselves to be assigned to the assessment. Vale Oren had been present at the meeting where this request was discussed. He had been present not because he was a required participant but because Commander Knoll had mentioned to him, informally, that the meeting might be interesting, and Vale Oren had learned to treat informal comments from Commander Knoll as a particular kind of information. The Coalition's senior strategic officer, Admiral Sathvel, not Sathvor, a different Vorith, had asked Knoll what the humans could bring to the assessment that 3 specialist teams had not provided. Knoll had said, "We think the first 3 teams were asking the right question wrong." Sathvel had asked him to explain. Knoll had said, "The question everyone's been asking is how do we get through the HFY defensive network? We'd like to ask a different question." Sathvel had said, "Which is?" Knoll had said, "What does the network need to keep working?" The meeting had continued for 40 more minutes. Vorin had recorded all of it. The specific exchange he kept returning to came near the end. Sathvel had asked, not dismissively but with the particular precision of a very intelligent being genuinely probing an unfamiliar idea, "What makes you confident that a different question will yield a more viable answer?" Knoll had said, without any particular drama, "We've been in harder places." Sathvel had said, "That is not an analytical argument." Knoll had said, "No, but it's a true one." The humans were assigned to the SciFi assessment. What they came back with, 11 days later, was not what anyone had expected. They had not found a way through the defensive network. They had found something else. They had found that the HFY's defensive network at SciFi was drawing power from 3 relay nodes in a pattern that had a single point of interdependency, a single node whose failure would cascade through the other 2 and produce a 47-minute window of significantly reduced defensive coverage. This node was not inside the heavily defended perimeter. It was outside it, in a location that 3 assessment teams had classified as peripheral and not examined closely. When Vale Oren asked Voss how they had identified this, she said, "We looked at what the defense was protecting instead of where it was thick." He wrote, "The human approach to tactical problems appears to involve a fundamental reorientation of the question that precedes any analysis of the answer. They do not ask, how do we overcome this obstacle, as the primary question. They ask, what does the obstacle require to exist, and work backward from the answer. This is not a novel analytical approach in theory. Coalition's strategic doctrine contains versions of it. In practice, the execution requires a willingness to spend time in a state of not knowing, of inhabiting an incomplete picture that most species' crisis response systems work against. Humans appear to be more comfortable in this state than any species I have previously assessed. I am not sure if this is a cognitive trait or a cultural one or something that emerges from whatever their training does to them. I am filing a formal request for access to human military training records, *. The formal request was approved. He received the training records. He read them over the course of 5 days. On the 5th day, he wrote a single line in his private notes and did not return to it for 3 weeks. The line was, "I think we have made a serious mistake in how we have been thinking about this species." He did not elaborate. The elaboration would come later. For now, he was too busy with the SciFi operation. The SciFi operation was executed 22 days after Knoll's assessment was accepted by Coalition Command. It involved a small, fast strike unit tasked with reaching the exterior relay node while a larger coalition force staged a conventional-looking approach at the perimeter that would occupy the HFY's defensive attention. The strike unit was mixed, 4 coalition species, 6 humans, and it was commanded by Warrant Officer Voss. This had been controversial. Not because anyone doubted Voss's capability, exactly, but because the situation called for what coalition doctrine described as a precision insertion, and the consensus institutional view was that this was work for specialists with specific insertion training, and that while the humans had demonstrated unusual resilience in previous engagements, what was needed here was precision rather than resilience. Noel had simply said, "She'll do it." No elaboration. No supporting argument. The same quality of statement as, "We've been in harder places." Not analytical, just true in a way that Noel seemed to feel did not require defense. Sathvel had, after a long pause, approved the assignment. Valoran had watched Voss receive the assignment briefing. She had listened, asked 3 precise technical questions, received the answers, and then said, "When do we go?" Not, "I understand the risk." Not, "I accept the mission." Just, "When do we go?" He thought about this later. He thought about the difference between theatrical courage and functional willingness and whether humans even distinguished between them in the way that the coalition species he was most familiar with did. He thought about what Voss had told him weeks ago about fear, that she was afraid, that the signal was still there, that she had learned to work past it. He thought about whether what he had read in the training records changed his interpretation of that. The training records had been troubling, not cruel. He had worried, before reading them, that they might be cruel, that whatever process the humans used to produce their particular psychological profile might involve something that the coalition's institutional ethics would need to flag. They were not cruel in that way. They were not designed to inflict suffering. They were designed to produce familiarity. Specifically, familiarity with suffering, with failure, with the experience of being at one's limit, so that when those things occurred in an operational context, they were not unknown. They were known. They had been met before, in training, and the individual had continued past them, and now the individual's body and mind had, through a mechanism that the human psychologists described in their records with technical language that translated imperfectly but that Vale Oren rendered approximately as integration of the experience into the self, had incorporated the knowledge that they could continue past this point. This was, Vale Oren thought, a specific kind of violence done to oneself voluntarily in order to produce a specific capability. He did not know how to evaluate this morally. He filed it in the problem document. The Sethvar operation ran for 11 hours. Vale Oren followed it from the Tactical Operations Center on Orendath, watching the telemetry with the quality of attention that he usually reserved for things he could not yet explain. The strike unit hit complications at hour 3. The exterior relay node's approach was less clear than the assessment had indicated. There was a secondary defensive emplacement that had not been visible in the survey data, and the unit lost 17 minutes repositioning. At hour 5, 2 of the 6 human members of the strike unit sustained injuries severe enough that the coalition's doctrinal threshold for mission abort was exceeded. The unit was not aborted. Voss filed a situational report that stated the injuries were non-limiting for mission completion, and continued. Vale Oren read the injury specifics in the medical channel. He read them twice. Non-limiting was not the word he would have used. At hour 7, the strike unit reached the node. The disruption was executed. The 47-minute window opened. The coalition's conventional approach force pushed through and reached the corridor. At hour 9, the strike unit began exfiltration with their 2 injured members. At hour 11, they were recovered. Both injured humans were alive. One required surgery that lasted 6 hours and would, Chetheus reported, result in permanent partial loss of function in one limb. The other required 4 hours of surgical intervention and would recover fully. Voss had 3 broken ribs that she had not reported during the operation because they were, she later told the debrief officer, annoying but manageable. The corridor at Sethvar was disrupted for 63 days, which was outside the upper range of the model's projection. The coalition's forward repositioning was completed in 51. These 2 facts were related. Vale Oren wrote, in the problem, *, the Sethvar operation succeeded. By the standards that the coalition uses to evaluate operational success, it succeeded clearly, objective achieved, no fatalities, strategic window produced, repositioning facilitated. By those standards, the assessment should end here. But I find that I cannot stop at those standards, because those standards don't contain the thing that is actually significant about what I observed. He wrote, *, the 2 injured humans were carried by their unit members throughout the final 4 hours of the operation. This was not questioned. This was not evaluated as a tactical cost. It was simply done. When I asked Voss about this in the debrief, she looked at me in the way that people look at someone who has asked a question with an obvious answer and said, "We don't leave people." I asked her if there were circumstances under which they would. She said, "No." I asked her if this applied even when the strategic cost of carrying injured personnel exceeded the strategic benefit. She considered this for a moment and then said, "We'd find a way to make the math work." He wrote, I believe she meant this literally. Not as a statement about values. As a statement about problem solving. The constraint is not negotiable, so the solution must accommodate it. This is not how the coalition calculates operational cost. And I am beginning to think that this difference in calculation method is more significant than anything else I have observed. The war continued. The coalition's repositioning, enabled by the Sethvar corridor disruption, allowed a significant consolidation of its defensive lines in the Orendath sector and 3 neighboring regions. The Kef-Salur advance did not stop. The Kef-Salur were not stopping, but it was no longer progressing at the rate that the coalition's models had projected. The models were being revised. The revision was uncomfortable because the new projections were better than the old ones. And this meant that the previous situation had been worse than anyone had officially admitted. Valoran was now attached to the human liaison team as a permanent assessment resource, which had been arranged through a process involving Commander Knoll having a conversation with someone in the integration committee that Valoran was not present for, but the result of which was that his assignment paperwork arrived one morning with the new designation already in it. He had not requested this reassignment. He had not been consulted about it. He had, however, spent several weeks making himself very useful to the human liaison team in ways that fell just outside his official assignment scope. He suspected Knoll had noticed. He mentioned this to Knoll once. Knoll had said, "People who ask good questions are hard to find. I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice you hanging around." Then he had gone back to the display he was looking at and not said anything else. Valoran had found this oddly comfortable. He was beginning to understand some things about how the humans communicated. The surface layer of it, the words, was often less significant than the layer beneath it, which was what the words were not saying and what the speaker assumed the listener could infer. There was a compression in their communication that took time to develop a sensitivity to. He was developing it. He was also, in the process, revising the formal analytical notes in the problem document. He had begun the document thinking he was documenting an anomaly. He was now fairly certain he was documenting something structural. The humans had arrived at month 17 of a war that was going badly. The coalition's loss rate on contested objectives had been 63%. By month 24, 7 months after human integration, the loss rate had dropped to 44%. By month 27, it was 31%. These numbers required explanation, and the Military Analysis Division was working on providing one. The explanation they were developing involved language about tactical innovation, asymmetric problem-solving approaches, and cross-species integration benefits, all of which were true in the specific technical sense and none of which captured the thing that Valoran had been watching. He was watching a species that was changing the war not by being stronger but by being differently organized at the level of what they could not give up. They would not abandon their injured. They would not abandon their dead. They would not abandon a tactical observation made during a decompression event. They would not abandon a 7th approach after 6 had failed. They would not abandon the unit member who was, by any objective calculation, slowing the mission. And this refusal, this absolute structural refusal to accept certain categories of loss, was producing outcomes that the models hadn't predicted, because the models hadn't modeled it. How do you build a predictive model for a species whose primary tactical characteristic is that they will not stop? The Kef-Salur had. This was the thing Valoran had not understood until he began reading the Kef-Salur's own intercepted communications, which the Intelligence Division had begun sharing with him as part of his expanded assessment role. He was not a linguist, and the translation was imperfect, but the structure of the Kef-Salur's tactical thinking was available in the intercepts in a way that made a specific pattern visible. The Kef-Salur's advance had been calibrated to coalition behavior. Not the behavior the coalition thought it was showing. The official doctrine, the institutional positions, the formal strategic commitments, but the actual behavior. The way that coalition units behaved when the cost of a position exceeded a certain threshold. The rate at which, historically, coalition formations had accepted strategic withdrawal over continued engagement past the point of efficiency. The HFY had studied this. They had built a model of it. Their advance was designed to exploit it, to present costs that exceeded the coalition's threshold just quickly enough and just consistently enough that the coalition would continue making the rational decision to yield ground rather than pay more for diminishing returns. It had been working for 19 months. It had stopped working because the humans didn't have the same threshold. Or rather, and this was the thing that Vale Oren spent 3 days wrestling with before he could write it clearly, the humans had a threshold. They had a breaking point. They bled. They grieve. He had watched Voss sit quietly in the Tactical Operations Center after the exfiltration at Sethvar for 20 minutes not doing anything, and he knew, without being told, what that was. They had losses, and the losses cost them something real, and they did not pretend otherwise. But whatever the HFY had calculated as the coalition's threshold, whatever that point was at which rational actors accepted that the cost exceeded the value, humans passed it and kept going. Not recklessly. Not without counting the cost. They counted it. Voss's expression during those 20 minutes in the operations center was the expression of someone adding up numbers that hurt. And then she stood up and went back to work. The HFY's model had no variable for this. Vale Oren wrote it plainly in the document. Asterisk, the HFY built their advance around a correct understanding of how the coalition's member species make decisions about acceptable cost. The model was excellent. It was based on real behavioral data and it performed accurately for 19 months. Its single catastrophic flaw is that it assumed the humans would follow the same behavioral logic. They don't. This is not because humans are indifferent to cost. It is because the human decision architecture, for reasons I still don't fully understand, that appear to involve culture and training and something I can only describe as deliberate psychological engineering, decouples the experience of cost from the decision to continue. They feel the cost completely. They decide to continue anyway. The HFY's model doesn't have a variable that represents experiencing full cost and continuing regardless. No model that I'm aware of has that variable. We have all, I think, been studying the wrong things about this species. Asterisk. He saved the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he forwarded it to Admiral Sathvel with a cover note that said, "In full, asterisk Admiral, I am sending you a document that is not a formal report. It is 11 months of analytical notes that I believe describe something about the human species that the coalition has not formally registered. I would ask you to read it not as an assessor's document but as information you personally might find important. I recognize this is an unusual request, asterisk." He sent it. Sathvel read it in 2 days. He knew this because Sathvel sent a brief response that said, asterisk, "I will need time to consider what this means for our strategic planning. In the meantime, please continue your work, asterisk." Not yes. Not no. I will need time to consider. Which was, Vale Oren thought, the most honest response a very intelligent being could give to information that reorganized something fundamental. Month 31. The war was different now, and the difference was visible not just in the numbers. The loss rate on contested objectives was now 22%, and the HFY advance had not only stopped but reversed in 4 sectors, but in the character of coalition operations. The humans were not commanding. They were not setting strategy at the highest levels. They were doing something more diffuse than that. They were present in every operations center, every assessment team, every forward unit that had integration slots allocated to them, and they were asking the question that preceded the analysis. They were inhabiting the incomplete picture. They were filing reports during decompression events and proposing 7th approaches and carrying their injured and refusing to let the math determine what was not negotiable. And slowly, not by instruction, not by policy, not by any formal institutional mechanism, the coalition's other species were beginning to change. Vale Oren watched this with the particular attention he reserved for things that were significant. A Vorith tactical team, working alongside a human unit for 4 months, began incorporating something that looked like the human process of generating and discarding incorrect hypotheses rapidly rather than spending time in careful recalibration before each new approach. The performance data on the Vorith team improved. The Vorith team did not comment on this. The humans did not comment on this. Valoran noted it. A Sorini medical unit working with the Coalition's human liaison medical staff began, in the specific operational context of forward position trauma care, slightly extending what had previously been their standard threshold for recoverable versus non-recoverable assessment. Not dramatically. By a margin that would have been, in any individual case, within the range of normal clinical variation. But consistently, across multiple cases. Chethis, when Valoran asked him about this indirectly, was silent for a moment and then said, "The human medical staff have different expectations about what a body can do. After you work alongside them long enough, you start wondering if your expectations were calibrated correctly." Valoran wrote, "The humans are not changing the war through force. They are changing the war through proximity. Something about operating near them consistently recalibrates the expectations of other species. This is happening without anyone intending it. I don't know if this is something the humans are aware of. I suspect it doesn't matter whether they're aware of it. Month 34. A formal inquiry arrived from the Kethsaluar. Not a surrender. Not a peace offer. A request for what the diplomatic protocol called a strategic reassessment conversation, which was the way that a species with the Kethsaluar's particular institutional self-image could initiate negotiations without using the word negotiations. The coalition's response was carefully worded by 17 senior diplomats and took 11 days to finalize. Valoran was not involved in drafting the response. He was, at this point, doing something more important. He was writing the full report, not the informal analytical notes of the problem document. The formal, complete, institutional report that he had been building toward for 22 months. The report that tried to say, in the clearest language he could find, what the coalition had misunderstood about the species it had provisionally accepted into membership 17 months into a war that had been going very badly. The report was 47 pages long. It contained, in its conclusion section, the following paragraphs. The standard coalition framework for evaluating species military potential assesses the following variables: physiological strength, cognitive processing speed and capacity, technological sophistication, strategic institutional history, and cultural orientation toward collective action. By these variables, humans ranked as a mid-tier potential military partner at time of integration. This assessment was accurate. The framework was applied correctly. The assessment was nonetheless profoundly wrong, because it measured everything except the variable that turned out to matter most. What humans brought to this conflict was not superior physical capability. It was not superior intelligence. It was not superior technology. It was a specific and, I believe, unique psychological architecture that allows them to experience the full weight of cost, physical, emotional, social, and continue operating. Not in spite of feeling the cost, but alongside it. Humans feel everything. They grieve their dead. They carry their injured. They remember their failures. They experience fear. None of this stops them. In some way I do not yet have the theoretical framework to fully articulate. The experience of these things appears to generate in them not incapacity, but a kind of momentum that our models have no variable for. The Kethsaluar built an excellent advance model based on a correct understanding of how rational actors respond to cost. The advance failed because humans are not irrational. They are rational in a way that includes a category that our collective institutional understanding of rationality has excluded. The category is something like the decision to continue past the point where continuation makes sense, made deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, because the alternative involves a form of loss that the species will not accept. I want to be precise about what I am saying. I am not saying humans are braver than other species. I am not saying they are more heroic. I am saying that they have, through some combination of biology, culture, and what their training records describe as deliberate psychological conditioning, created in themselves a structural incapacity to surrender certain things, certain people, certain obligations, certain minimum commitments to one another, that makes them, in conflict conditions, a fundamentally different kind of actor than anything the coalition has previously integrated. I am also saying that the coalition did not understand this when it accepted them, and that this has had significant consequences, not all of which are negative, but some of which will require careful institutional attention. I am also saying, and I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the report that I expect will receive the most scrutiny, that I am not certain the humans fully understand this about themselves. Not the tactical implications, which they clearly understand, but the deeper thing, the thing underneath it, the thing that their training records describe in technical language but that I think is actually about something that they have not articulated to us and may not articulate to themselves. They do not stop. The galaxy should think carefully about what it will mean in the long run, that there is now a species among us that does not stop. He sent the report to Admiral Sathville. He sent copies to the Coalition Integration Committee, the Military Analysis Division, and the Diplomatic Relations Office handling the Kefsaluer reassessment conversation. Then he went to find Commander Knoll. He found him in the station's small observation bay, a viewport room, rarely used, where you could see the stars directly rather than through a display. Knoll was standing at the viewport looking at nothing in particular, which was the human version of doing exactly that. Thorin stood beside him. Outside the viewport, the Orendath sector was quiet. The Kefsaluer had pulled back 2 weeks ago from the nearest contested region. The sector was not peaceful. It was the particular held-breath stillness of a situation between states, but it was quiet. Valoran said, "I have a question." Knoll said, "Ask it." He said, "When you came to the coalition, the integration committee said the two documents weren't separable, the membership application and the military cooperation agreement. Why weren't they separable?" Knoll looked at the stars for a moment. He said, "Because we'd been watching the war for 2 years before we came. We knew what was happening. We knew where it was going." He paused. "We don't really do joining something after deciding it's safe. We join things before they're decided, when there's still something to contribute." Valoran said, "You came because you thought you could help." Knoll said, "We came because we knew you couldn't win it without us." It was not arrogance, Valoran thought. The tone was wrong for arrogance. It was the same tone as, "We've been in harder places," a statement of something Knoll believed was true the way he believed other factual things were true, because the evidence supported it. He said, "Were you afraid? When you came?" Knoll said, "Yes." He said, "But you came anyway." Knoll looked at him. He said, "You know the answer to that." Valoran did. He looked at the stars. He thought about Voss, filing a report in the medical bay 18 hours after a decompression event. He thought about the 6th failed approach and the 7th that worked. He thought about the human members of the Sethvar strike team carrying their injured through the final 4 hours. He thought about, "We don't leave people," and "I'll need to account for the gap," and the 20 minutes in the operations center that cost something real and then we're over. He thought about his report and the line he had been most careful about. The galaxy should think carefully about what it will mean in the long run, that there is now a species among us that does not stop. He did not think the galaxy had thought carefully about it yet. He was not sure the galaxy was capable of thinking carefully about it until it had more time watching the humans work. Outside the viewport, the sector was quiet, but quiet like something that had recently been loud and was resting, not quiet like something that was resolved. The Kefsaluer were at the table now. The diplomatic channels were open. The war was moving towards something that would, eventually, be called an end. But Valoran had read 40 years of human military history. He had read their training records. He had watched Voss and Knoll and the unnamed members of a strike team who carried each other out of a defended corridor on a destroyed timeline. He did not think this species would stop at the end of this war. He thought they would look at the next thing that needed addressing, the next place where the math had been accepted as settled and the solution had been judged too costly, and they would ask the question that preceded the analysis. They would inhabit the incomplete picture. They would fail 6 times and propose a 7th. He thought that was what they were. He thought the galaxy had been very close to losing something that it didn't yet know how to value, and that the humans had arrived and turned the edge of that loss with instruments that nobody had put in the models. He thought about the Integration Committee subcommittee, which had determined that his suggested framework additions were premature without additional supporting data. He had now provided 47 pages of additional supporting data. He expected the subcommittee would need more time to consider. He was developing, he thought, a human habit. He would wait. He would continue the work. He would document what he saw with the most careful language he could find. He would ask questions until the answers changed his questions. He would file reports from places he was not supposed to be, about things that did not fit existing categories, and he would keep the informal analytical notes that were more honest than the formal ones, and he would slowly, methodically, accumulate the evidence for something that he could feel was true but not yet prove. He would not stop. He was not sure when he had started doing this. He suspected it was somewhere between a decompression event and a seventh approach and 20 minutes of quiet in an operations center that cost something real. He suspected it would not be reversible. Outside the viewport, the stars were indifferent. The sector was quiet. And deep in a document titled The Problem, in a final line added after the formal report was filed and sent, he had written, "I came to this assignment trying to understand what was strange about the humans. I think I have finally understood it. The strange thing is not that they continue. The strange thing is that when you are near them long enough, you start to understand why continuing is the only thing that makes sense. And once you understand that, I don't think you can stop understanding it. I'm not sure, anymore, whether that frightens me or whether I am grateful. I think it may be that those two things are not, in the end, as separable as I once assumed. He saved the document. He stood beside Commander Knoll at the viewport, and neither of them said anything, and outside the stars were very old and very patient, and somewhere in the Kefsaluers territory a diplomatic team was preparing for a conversation that would end a war, and the war would end, and then something else would begin, and the humans would be there for that too, proposing the seventh approach, carrying the injured, filing the report, refusing to let the math determine what was not negotiable. And the galaxy, which had been very close to a different kind of ending, would continue. Not because the humans were invincible. Not because they were exceptional in the categories anyone had measured, but because they had walked into a losing war with two documents that weren't separable, and they had been afraid, and they had come anyway, and they had kept coming, and they had not stopped, and somehow, in a way that 47 pages of careful formal assessment still could not fully contain, that had been exactly enough.